Hi, everybody. Today's subject is going to be on prayer, especially on the Psalms. We're going to be speaking about how it is. I'm going to place it here. We're going to have a Bible right there. We're going to speak about how it is that we are to pray, how it is that we are to be able to connect with God. And in a lot of recent videos, I've been speaking about how it is that I've been engaging more in generating short prayers, kind of in the tradition of Venerable Consolata Petrone, kind of in the tradition of Frank Laubach, the practice of the presence of God type traditions also. So we've really been speaking a lot about this practice of short prayers. And it seemed that for me, short prayers seemed to be important that they were short. But I think that something that's really important is not so much the length of our prayers, and they can be short, they can be long. The thing I think is about the attitudes that are found in them. One of the things that really was opening up for me as I've been praying recently is the attitude of inviting God to come in. So if I'm repeating the name of Jesus, there's this act of holding to the name, inviting him into the places where I'm in pain, or so on and so forth, bringing him in. There's this balance in the act, whereas it's not just kind of a striving or like shooting off the name like a little thing, hoping that for the best. There's this holding and relating, and there's this balance in the act of invitation. So it's not that you're just striving to focus your mind, to keep your mind on one thing. It's that you're inviting God in. There's this effort and surrender, which are together. And so the same is true if you are using your senses in a prayerful way. You're letting yourself receive what God is giving you. You're not just kind of being this meditation master who's focusing your mind analytically. You're receiving a gift. So there's a balance that is contained in this. And so I wanted to just kind of highlight the fact that the questions that there are principles that are involved in prayer, such as sustaining attention, such as balance, such as these things. And it's these things that are part of the active ingredients in terms of communication skills, as well as God Himself operating in the prayer. So there's these lots of these kind of active ingredients that are present in how we pray. And I think that the thing is that what happens is that you can actually use longer prayers. It doesn't have to be short prayers. There was a method that I once found that someone was writing about, the method of babbling in prayer. And what they meant by this was being like a baby and rapidly describing to God what one needs in a kind of not frantic way, but it was kind of like, oh no, God, I really feel like I'm going to be tempted by this. I really need your help. Please be with me, please. Oh no, like kind of like just kind of this little rambling type of prayer. And I think it's interesting because one could do that type of prayer in a way that has many of the same balanced attitudes as the short, focused prayers of, say, like, Lord, fill them with peace, or an established prayer like, Jesus, Mary, I love you, save souls. One can kind of focus attention by babbling like that. And so it is possible to sustain connection in multiple ways. If we don't have to only relate to God through short prayers or long prayers, there's ways in which the same ingredients of sustained attention and surrender, because I think the important thing here is, like, if someone is babbling fearfully, there's not a balance of attitudes. And I think it's so important when we think about the Psalms, because the Psalms are full of a balance of attitudes. They have a kind of spiritual DNA, which is like this blend of all these balanced attitudes. So it's not really that we have to do things a certain way. It's that there has to be the right DNA, you know, and this right connection to God in it. There's got to be all this correct. It's almost like branding or core values or something. It's like a brand of a company. We have to be following the brand. It has to kind of go with the whole flow of the aesthetic or something like that. It's not that we have to do prayer in a certain manner. It's that it has to be at the right vibe. It has to be the psalmative vibe. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in some other elements of this video. And it's important to realize that, even, these methods, like, there could be a spectrum of methods, from saying the name of Jesus in a structured way to just describing what you're going through. And it's interesting that when I blew up my mind in my wonderful erroneous use of trying to become enlightened, um, I needed to recover. The way I recovered from the side effects of meditation, of Eastern meditation, was by using actually both of these techniques. I would hold a rosary and I would repeat the name of Jesus in a very kind of like truncated way because I was terrified of things, just trying to hold my mind on something. So I did some meditation of some kind. And then I would also talk to God about how distressed I was and was basically babbling and saying, "Oh no, I think I'm going to go crazy. I feel so weird." And those things together, and plus going to church and hearing some things that priests said, and eventually returning to the sacraments, these things eventually were the healing that I was looking for. So I think it's really important to realize that there's a spectrum of these methods, and they have been effective in my life and other people's lives. But the thing that we're really looking for is to see into the DNA of the Psalms. We're trying to see into what is the substance of this whole environment of prayer, and how do we understand how to be in this kind of relational world of the Psalms. And I think that this gives us a sense of like, what are the guidelines? Because I feel like I always used to try to say, well, am I even allowed to say the things in the Psalms? And there may be some ways in which in the New Covenant there could be some modification of how we say the Psalms. But I'm going to go into this in depth in this video. I think that one of the important principles here is that it's something that I found in the teaching of hypnosis. And one of the guys said who taught hypnosis was Dr. David Snyder. He talks about how don't focus on learning scripts for hypnosis. Don't focus on learning NLP scripts. Don't focus on this. Learn the principles involved so that then if things go off the rails, you'll know what to do. You'll know how to guide the person out of it. So it's really important that we understand the principles, not just the scripts. And so it's interesting that I think it's like this in how we express emotions in prayer, because I used to try to come up with fake moral theology guidelines of how we could do this. I used to say things like, all right, so I could tell God, God, I feel this way, but I can't say my life is terrible. I would try to make these guidelines, and there's some truth to saying, hey, we don't want to say disrespectful things to God. We don't want to get sucked into our negative thoughts. We don't want our processing things with God through prayer to degenerate into venting, because venting can become sinful because then we're just indulging the thoughts rather than processing them, and that can become sinful and unhelpful. But the thing here is that there's a lot of things here. Like I would try to, in the past, vent my feelings. I would try to do, because I thought that was what I was supposed to do. I try to do that and try to connect with God that way. And probably we should just be a little more natural. It's like we shouldn't force ourselves. But the thing is that there can also be a sense of like, maybe I shouldn't say anything. So how do we do it? And what is the way here? Well, I think it's really about having balance. It's really about, again, tapping into that psalmative DNA, having the balanced attitudes of the Psalms, and as we'll see in later descriptions in this video, the balance as it kind of resides in the New Covenant rather than in the Old. And if we have the right DNA in our way of talking, in our way of being, it's not about getting it exactly right. It's almost a contrast between, in the East, there was Taoism and then Confucianism. Confucianism had all these rules of propriety about how to act, how to talk to your superiors, how to talk to your father, how to talk to the king, how to talk to all these things. There were all these different ways of relating that were prescribed. And I think I've really been trying to be very much like a Confucian in a sense. I've been trying to make these rules for how it is that I bring feelings to God in prayer, rather than taking the opposite approach in the Chinese culture, which is the Taoist approach, which is just having balance and harmony, being natural. And this balance and harmony, this kind of vibe of the Psalms that I'm talking about here, I think is the real answer, because it's not about having a certain way or a certain script of praying the Psalms or a certain way of expressing our feelings to God. It's, are we doing it in terms of the same branding? Are we doing it in terms of the same balance? That's more of that Taoist way of looking at it. And so it's having a thing that is all, it's having these correct principles so that we are in an attitude that is processing and balanced rather than venting and unbalanced. And of course, the goal is to have self understanding and healing rather than ranting. And of course, ranting is wrong. But the thing is, we have to understand that ranting is qualitatively wrong, not categorically wrong. It's not like, oh, you're in or you're out. You have to have a certain guideline. It's like on a spectrum, like how much are you leaning into balance or how unbalanced are you? It's probable that it's not necessarily a sin to say most things to God in prayer because it's because you're praying. And it's unless there's some really grievous reason why you shouldn't be, like you have a temptation to kill everybody all the time, and you shouldn't think about that or something like that. It's like maybe in general there is this sense in which it's a level of, we want to have more balance, we want to have more openness, we want to have that balance and that healthiness to it. So that's one way of describing this. And I think that this connects to a really important principle that I've heard articulated two ways. One is by the Sisters of the Sisters of the Little Way. They make videos about recovery from spiritual abuse, and they made this video about how sometimes an act of hope can look like being angry at God, or can look like having anger. And they described like how that the substance of hope isn't always gone, and how we may express different acts. And it would almost be that if this principle was not true, then the Psalms would be sins. And this is very similar to something a priest once told me, where he said, you could say things to God because if you're saying something to him about like how he's seems to not be coming through for you in some way, that bringing it to him is an act of trust that he is the kind of God that would do that, basically. I'm adding a little bit of elaboration on that, but that's basically what was said. These are very similar teachings. And they point to the fact that it's not so much what we say, but the tone or the environment or the whole total vibe and milieu of what we're doing. Whether what we're doing is a dynamic, processing, balanced thing that keeps the DNA of the Psalms as seen in the New Covenant, or is it something else? And we could even say in the New Covenant, the Psalms are deeply related to the Rosary, because they have the joyful, the sorrowful, and the glorious. And the Psalms convey emotion and trust and God and all these different things. There's all different things that the Psalms convey. Another thing that's important is that there may be certain things we shouldn't describe in detail. But the thing is, I think that there's a principle in prayer. Like, so for example, if there's impure thoughts or extensively angry thoughts, you might not need to go into extensive detail. But I also think it's very dangerous in terms of scrupulosity to think that there's certain things we can't tell God about. And it may just be in a natural way, realizing that you can say sufficient detail. Like maybe it's just saying, okay, God, I'm tempted to impurity, or I'm tempted to anger. You might not need to be that detailed anyway. And rather than thinking about it like I can't be detailed and worrying about it and freaking out, it's really might just be like, okay, we don't need to. We can sufficiently talk about it enough that we don't need to trigger avoidance. And that's the thing, is sometimes we're so afraid we're trying to avoid things because we don't want to do direct resistance where the church says it's not a good idea, such as with impurity. We kind of don't realize that maybe we're not even putting ourselves into an occasion of sin. Maybe the principles involved make it so that you can, without going into an occasion of sin, sufficiently describe what's happening inside you to God. So that it almost functions like a label and permits full understanding without bizarre dwelling on it. And it's always important, I think, to think about everything I'm talking about here is a type of creative obedience to the principles of the interior life, such as indirect resistance, or these things that we want to do if we want to deal with certain types of thought states and things like that. We're doing these things not categorically, but understanding that they are a dynamic set of principles that we are entering into. So that's very important. Just looking here, I'm thinking about different things. I think also one of the things that was really important, again, I was always trying to find guidelines for being able to be psalmative, or to be able to be like with the Psalms. And one of the things that's important here is something that was talked about by Annie Lala. She's a relationship coach, and she talked about a few different things here. And she talks. I'm not going to kind of try to talk about the whole approach that she used, but in terms of something that's really important is that she discussed things like being able to bring our pain to somebody. And that's important to just voice the pain directly, to stay with the pain, not to go into accusatory complaints. And it was really beautiful how like she made that contrast, like telling someone how you are hurt rather than say, you hurt me, you jerk, basically, is what she's saying to not do. So we don't want to be accusatory. But it's really interesting. She used the example of Martin Luther King Jr. as like an example of voicing one's feelings constructively and being able to have a range of feelings constructively, advocating for change and so on and so forth. And I think it's interesting. I think it's a very interesting way of thinking about. It's a way of thinking about how of some guidelines for how do we express ourselves properly. So it's like about being open with our pain, not going into like an indulgent complaint. And that's really what we don't want to go into accusatory complaints and blame and shame and hate and all these things. That's not where we want to go. And there's that contrast in the scriptures between complaint and lament. Lament is kind of connected to God, whereas complaint is like a personal drama. And so these are some things that I think are important. But it's important because the scriptures do tell us to pour out our hearts, and we want to know how do we do it rather than harming ourselves. We want to pour out our hearts, not vent our emotions. And I think maybe that's the distinction. It's the distinction between the heart and the emotions. Are we speaking from the heart? And even are we speaking from the heart in the new covenant? Are we speaking in a way that is deep and real and balanced from the core of who we are, but in the new covenant? I think what's really a beautiful way, because I would also think when I would think about the Psalms, there's certain guidelines that the church fathers would have, or the desert fathers. They would pray the Psalms like they wouldn't pray in the Psalms sometimes. Like there's things like, oh, give me the heads of my enemies, and things that kind of sound like that. And they would say that the way to deal with this is to make that about demons. Is to make the imprecatory Psalms about those type of enemies. But I think what's really important here is that, that's usable. But I would say, okay, well, this is just making me more scared and making me say, okay, well, I can't really talk to God. I can't really pour out my heart. I can't pray with the Psalms. How does this work? Well, I think one of the things that can help me, or maybe help you too, in praying the Psalms is to pray the Psalms with the heart of St. Francis, or pray the Psalms with a St. Francis filter. Because St. Francis, I believe, is somebody who we could see is like, he writes the Canticle of the Creatures. He's very expressive. He dances like David. St. Francis is very much like David in that he dances. There's that image always of the happy Franciscan friar. There's this kind of sense in which there's this celebration of life. There's imagery of nature that David has in there. That's very similar with St. Francis. But we can realize that David is speaking in an old covenant context where this balance, this DNA, is not yet on the other side of the cross. And so really what we're doing is we're translating this psalmative DNA through the lens of the cross, where like up is down and down is up now. And so it's the Franciscan thing would be like, okay, like it doesn't mean I can't pray the Psalms to defeat my enemies, but it means like you could say any number of things. Those Psalms could now in the new covenant, where the DNA is kind of flipped upside down and the kingdom has come, in a sense, into our hearts, and they're now a part of this upside down kingdom. We could say, oh, my enemies could be demons. My enemies could be the fact that my enemies are my enemies. Like there's a lot of ways that my enemies could be the positive things in my life. My enemies could be my friends. It's thinking about that kind of backwards logic of the new covenant. That's the filter we need. We need, and especially like when you see like St. Francis valuing the poor, you see him kissing the leper. You see how we could take the Psalms and pour out our hearts, but we want to also kind of try to think with that lens of St. Francis as part of the ingredients, because we want to synthesize these ingredients into a way that lets us pray them, but lets us pray them in the way that these principles come together now in this time period for us as believers in the New Covenant, not only St. David in the Old Covenant. So let's keep thinking about these things. Okay. Um, let's keep thinking about this. I'm looking through a list of different things here about this, and I think that again, it really matters most. If we kind of keep that idea of the Psalms, it's really important when we think about being able to um, keep to that DNA of that's all those principles, but those principles brought together now in the new covenant. With the cross. It's kind of how do we understand it? And it's almost like it's funny. The title of the book there is New Testament and then Psalms, but it's that we want to really be able to pray psalmatively in the New Testament, in the new covenant, and that's really what is important here. So I want to also talk a little bit about some various different methods that kind of methods and principles that we can kind of expand out from this psalmative repertoire. And some of these are methods that are not, we would say, not kosher if you were to do them by themselves, or contain errors or contain dangers. And I'm going to really talk about these things as to kind of show the full spectrum, because the Psalms are a set of acts. Like when one sits in mental prayer, one makes various acts, and that's what we see in the Psalms: acts of sorrow, acts of surrender, acts of contrition, acts of praise. They're essentially, the Psalms are a record of the practice of mental prayer. And mental prayer includes all the different types of acts and relations that we can have with God, and all these interactions. And there's many different psychological and spiritual, good or bad, kosher or not kosher, coping skills that can really give us a more full-bodied understanding of this full relational worldview that we can kind of enter into in this psalmative DNA. And so I really want to open this up for us so that we can really be able to work through our feelings and process them with God. And it becomes really important here to realize that the entirety of this process is an act of taking what is unconscious and letting it meet what is superconscious through the conscious. And what I mean by that is that we ourselves bring God into our pains and bring our pains into God. And that is the process of healing and integration. In methods such as, psychological or spiritual methods like reparenting, this could be framed as, using your adult self to bring your child self to your higher self. You could say all kinds of things like that. There's all different ways we could talk about these processes, but it ends up being this type of interior integrative process. And it's, there's many different techniques. And so I'm going to list some of them. So, and I don't recommend these authors necessarily wholesale at all. So Dr. David R. Hawkins has a book called Letting Go. There are things like Eugene Gendlin has a thing called focusing, or then there's biospiritual focusing. There are the teachings of the Plum Village tradition, where they talk to their anger. Hello, my little anger. There's things like with Dan Buglio and reassurance statements toward the brain, where you say, okay, brain, it's safe. You don't have to make pain. There's things where street healers like Tom Lau, they talk to the pains and they make them go away. There's all these ways in which we can make various types of interior acts, where they're speaking to something. There's also things like the work of Byron Katie, where you ask questions. You see questions as a way of engaging with oneself and with God, like in various ways. In biospiritual focusing, the question is, can I be with the way this feels? In the work of Byron Katie, it's, who would I be without this thought? There's all these different acts. And again, I'm babbling in a sense here, because what I'm trying to convey is that all of these different techniques, though seemingly different, are really just ways of multiplying various interior acts, which can be seen as entries into a relational worldview. We mentioned St. Francis of Assisi, and he's a beautiful figure to think about in this regard, because he would speak to everything in creation. He would, talk about creation. He'd say, brother sun, sister moon. He would relate to creation much in the way that, Tom Loud says, pain, get out. Or the people in The TMS treatment will say, brain, be at peace. So St. Francis called his body brother donkey. So it's like there's all these things where, when we enter into um, a dialogue of awareness, of prayer, and all these things with our sensations and with our experience. And there's so many different techniques that can just kind of be brought into this one milieu of the New Testament way of praying the Psalms, like St. Francis. And, you know, I'm going to just say some notes from this because I was looking at some teachings from Dr. Hawkins. And it's interesting. Following Dr. Hawkins is what blew up my brain mostly, so I don't recommend following his work. But he has apparently a good book on letting go, and we're going to talk about that because he talks about you don't want to try to suppress what comes up. You don't want to fight against it. So you fight against your thoughts and your feelings. It doesn't work. Instead, you want to go to the kind of the underlying bodily energy or sensation behind the thoughts and feelings, and you want to surrender that, and you want to let that be as it is and let it go. And that's basically what he talks about. Because really what we're saying here is we have to go deep rather than superficial. And this is a good principle in general, but it also shows us some pitfalls and some promises in the process of growth. It shows us that when we go to the body, we have a potential to deal with things at their root, but also we have a potential of being incarnate. As Jesus takes on flesh, we can go to the flesh. And if we make this a process of bringing the love of God to those places, this is definitely something that could be redeemed. And we should not be against these techniques of doing nothing, because St. Francis de Sales uses this method of resistance to temptation, saying, pretend it's like all bees that have landed on you, don't move. Because if the more we resist, the more everything gets inflamed. These are psychological principles. We see Carl Jung saying, what you resist persists. These are true principles, but we want to apply them in the fullest possible context. Because, you see, one of the things here that can happen is that if we, there's this sense. I want to see if I can find it here. Yeah. So the thing is, if we don't use it in the right context, if we simply let go rather than surrender to Jesus, what happens is we end up with kind of a good technique, but we end up falling into the error that I believe is reflected in Jesus' statement of, when the eye is healthy, the body will be full of light. But if the light that is within you is darkness, how great is the darkness? If we practice a kind of enlightenment, if we practice a kind of light that is just letting go, there's a wisdom in that. There's a light of wisdom in that. But that wisdom is only partial. It doesn't go far enough. It kind of is like, if somebody is cohabitating with a spouse, with a partner rather than married to a spouse. I mean, it's like what happens is that we end up cheating on God with ourselves. And that's what happens when we let go rather than surrender to Christ. And we actually don't get the same results. We don't get the same self-gift. We don't get the same real healing. Because what happens is, as we kind of feel the pain in our body of the energy, so to speak, underneath our emotions, and we just let it go, and we could do all kinds of ways of doing it, which can be legitimate. We could ask questions, because can I be with how this feels? God, can you be with me in this? We could say it a few different ways, but the basic thing is we have to be doing it with God. Because if we don't, what's going to happen is we are going to end up doing it at a natural level, and the light that is within us will become dark. Because what will happen is that freedom that we find in ourselves will be sufficient enough for us to deal with our problems, but will also cut us off from God. And this can be very dangerous, because what happens is we become completely content in ourselves and then miss out on a deeper life both here and hereafter. And that's a very deadly thing. And it becomes, as Elder Sophrony of Essex said, these meditations can become a greater barrier to God than gross sin. So that is something very important to keep in mind here. But this is the way. I mean, there were many times in the past when I realized, like, the whole mental drama that I would have about scruples, for example, I would have to let that go. But yet I would tell God about the feeling in my body. Because rather than trying to say, oh no, I'm so nervous, I'd say, there's a pain over here. And again, you could see me trying to make guidelines here. You could see me trying to make boxes. There's not necessarily a hard and fast rule, I think. That's the whole point here of how to do this. But there are real principles. There's not a script, but there are principles. And we generally have to weave our life into these principles if we're going to be living a flowing life that is, as Dr. Nongard said, hypnotic. We don't want to be hypnotized. We want to become hypnotic. And we want to be, we want to be summative, so to speak. We want this DNA of these things. And so what else we got here? Let me think. So it's important, you hear things in even in IFS treatments, speak for the part, not from the part. This is kind of what we're trying to do. That's kind of exemplifies what we're trying to do when we're praying rather than venting. You're speaking for your pain or speaking to your pain rather than speaking from your pain. But these are principles and they're not like judgments, maybe. That's, I think, what I have to understand. So let's kind of, but and again, you don't want to be coming from the mental drama. You don't want to be coming from the emotion, but you want to speak about it. And, I think that what we're really saying here overall, what you see in these processes, when they're effective, they go deep. They reach as deep as the roots of our feelings, beyond just the passing thoughts and beyond the emotions on the surface. They reach down into the body. And all these things that we do, whether it's these different techniques, they're all part of the same milieu. And the goal is to be able to be balanced, to be deep, to be connected to Jesus Christ. And all these principles that are involved are all part of this milieu of the New Testament DNA of the Psalms that we are trying to enter into. And for example, David R. Hawkins' method is really just saying, surrender the whole thing at the root. It's not just the thought or the emotions. We aim for the whole bodily sensation. And this method, again, is integrative if we bring God in, but it will zero us out if we don't. We have to bring all that we have, all the things, all the roots of our pains to God, and the roots of pains in the energy and sensation of the body to God, and bring God to the roots. Because if we do it within as a letting go practice rather than a surrender to Christ practice, we get acceptance but lose out on love and mercy, and just get no story rather than a testimony. Because what you want is the testimony to be able to say, God loves me even in my pain. God loves me even though I'm a sinner. That's more rich than the poverty of acceptance and unity. So it's like a false meditation without prayer. Because the thing is, like, you end up thinking everything is one rather than that you are the beloved one despite being a sinner, which is juicier. So you're missing out on the real life, and you could miss out on salvation entirely because you're not doing it from this psalmative thing. You could almost say that there are two things, the calm and the psalm. And the problem is we don't want to do this merely as a method of calming everything. We want to do this as a method of psalming everything. And that may be a fun way of thinking about this. But calming it is important, but the whole thing is that the psalm is also not only a coping skill, it is also a lifestyle. It is a way of speaking to God. It is not just a coping technique, whereas many of these things are just coping techniques. Whereas the psalms are praise and joy and these things. We have to be living this out all the time. And so it's like the healing is part of it, but also hope and praise and all these things are also part of it too. So it's really important to realize that this is a lifestyle and that this is not just a coping skill. And therefore it's juicier because we have more interaction, we have more life when we have that thing of, I know even as I am known is greater than I know. It's St. Catherine of Siena's statement that God tells her, I am the one who is and you are she who is not, is greater than just the Buddhist saying, I don't exist, or the Hindu saying, I am the I am. There's more to this. There's a greater richness to being seen for who we are, to being loved for who we are, than there is to just accepting ourselves. Like there's this thing that's it's greater when someone else loves us and accepts us, and it's beautiful when that. And of course, there's a need that we have to kind of use our own acceptance as well. We can't kind of just I'm accepted by God, but I don't accept myself. It's kind of wacky, also. And again, all these things, they work because they have the right attitudes. And again, and this is blend, like just like with the sacraments, you only receive based on your disposition. You receive the grace based on your dispositions. Of course, sometimes you'll receive in sacramental context grace, you know, anyway, as long as you have enough of the right dispositions. Okay, if you go to confession, you have the right disposition, you're trying to really confess, yeah, that's going to work. But if you really go there with the right attitudes of receptivity, trust, mercy, and all these things, you'll get more graces. So the thing to remember here is that there's certain effects that these sentiments have, but obviously God is in the mix as well, and He's the one who's doing the active thing. And it's really all about having this right blend of attitudes. It's having the right general DNA to what we're doing as we are being as we're trying to be psalming in the New Testament rather than the Old Covenant, and not just trying to calm everything down. So that's the real thing that we're trying to do, because that's the pitfall. That calm is the pitfall we could fall into if we do this kind of balance without God. The balance without God zeroes everything out. Balance with God allows everything to kind of exist together. And so that's what we really want in the psalming type of processing interiorly, rather than the just the Buddhist kind of calming and zeroing everything out. This is, I think, a way of describing how, like in Buddhism, it's about destroying the emotions. It's nirvana, snuffing out desire and all that. Whereas in Christianity, it's about the moderation and integration of the passions. And as St. Pio said, when we engage in mental prayer, we are going to moderate, our, there's a, I don't know where it is. There's, I think, there's a little book of quotes of his around here somewhere, but it basically says that, we are, when we do mental prayer, we're moderating our conscience and impulses. And that's exactly what we're doing through all these different acts and things that we do interiorly. So that's a lot of things. And there's all these different approaches. If you look at them, there's elements that are redeemable from them and elements that are not. But the thing is, you see things like with the methods of Dr. David Snyder for healing, biospiritual focusing. You see the healing prayer of people like Tom Loud. You see the stuff like with Dan Buglio. You see the Plum Village techniques. You see David R. Hawkins's letting go technique. You see all these things as ways of engaging with the human person. And part of the repertoire of this new world, which is like this Franciscan world, where everything can relate to everything else, the brotherhood and sisterhood of all things under the fatherhood of God, where we are free to express ourselves. St. Francis was seen as like a troubadour. He was seen as someone who was singing, and this is what David was like. So it's like it's entering into this again, this world of the Psalms, where we can pour out our hearts, both what is painful and and positive, so to speak. But we could do so with this kind of understanding that we're doing it within the DNA of the New Testament, and we're doing it within the DNA of the Psalms. And so that's really, I think, a very beautiful and powerful thing. And so I hope that you enjoyed this video and that this is beneficial to you as you just kind of get your head around what it means to be able to pray the Psalms, what it means to be able to enter into them. How do we have that kind of emotional freedom with God? And how do we enter into that relationship with Him? And I hope this video gives you some food for thought in that regard.